Have you ever wondered why our bodies react very fast when it gets closer to objects or things that are detrimental to the body, even when it was by accident? If not, then your conscience will be made clear today. Now, these fast involuntary responses to stimuli is termed reflexes or reflex action. Over here, stimuli simply means a sudden change in the organism's environment. Now, stimuli is actually the plural form, and the singular form actually becomes stimulus. So we say stimulus is actually a sudden change in an organism's internal or external environment. Now, involuntary over here simply means that these responses or these changes or these effects are as a result of the unconscious choice of the organism. So without a conscious choice of the organism. Now, examples of these reflex actions, examples of these fast processes termed reflex actions include, we have jerking of the knee when it's struck by a metal. That is pretty common. We also have withdrawing one's hand quickly the moment it touches something very, very hot. And finally, sneezing when something unusual enters one's nose. Now, what actually makes these involuntary actions different from all other involuntary actions like heartbeat, digestion, and the rest is that it requires a stimulus for the activity. So over here, when we take the first diagram into consideration, you could see that the stimulus responsible for the mechanism was a change in pressure. When the doctor over there struck the knee of the little guy there, realized the knee jerked forward. So the change in pressure. Now, for the second diagram, it was as a result of the change in temperature between the fingers. So that caused the withdrawal of the hands. And finally, you could see this, the guy sneezing over there. It was because he inhaled something unusual into the nose. So that was a stimulus, inhaling something unusual into the nose. So that is it. Now, from these examples, we could see the common thing throughout is a stimulus. So before any reflex action occurs, there should be a stimulus. Now, the common question we can ask is, how do they occur? Now, what is the mechanism involved in the occurrence when it is triggered by a stimuli or a stimulus? So to illustrate the mechanism involved in reflex actions, I will use the most common reflexes, which is the withdrawing of one's hand after it has touched a very hot object. So let's do that very quick. Over here, we have a section of the human arm. Now, this is the arm. Now, the arm contains a muscle for movement. So there's a muscle in the arm. We also have a candle with fire on top to create the stimulus. Now, before we proceed, we need to know the key components of this mechanism, and they are simply neurons. We've actually made a video tutorials about neurons, describing their various parts and the functions of these parts. So if you have less knowledge about neurons, kindly lower the video description. I've actually placed a link to that particular video there. Kindly go through it and get back over here. So if you're done with that, let's move to the main mechanism involved in reflex actions. Now, in most reflex actions, there are 3 neurons involved. Though we have reflex actions involving only 2 neurons, this reflex action at least has 3 neurons. So we'll be talking about these 3 neurons found in this reflex action. Now, these 3 neurons include, we have the sensory neuron, the relay neuron, also known as the interneuron, and finally, the motor neuron. So these are basically the 3 neurons involved in this particular process. We would now require a section of the spinal cord due to the activities of neurons present. So what actually occurs is that when there's an increase in temperature between the fingers as a result of touching the fire on top of the candle, what happens is that temperature, that heating, is converted to electrical signals or electrical impulses. And these impulses are carried by this neuron. So they are carried all the way from the fingers, the temperature receptors in the fingers, all the way to the spinal cord, so like this. So you can see how long the neuron is. So it carries that impulse to the spinal cord. Now, when those impulses get to the spinal cord, they are given to another neuron. So the next neuron receives those impulses. Now, upon receiving the impulse, what happens is that part of these impulses are relayed or carried to the brain for the brain to issue a command. Now, that is what basically happens in most processes involving the nervous system. But there's an exception when we come to reflex actions. In reflex actions, we do not wait for the brain to issue a command. Now, instead of waiting for the brain to issue an appropriate command in response to the impulses it has received, that doesn't happen. But instead, the neuron with the impulses actually passes it on to the next neuron, all the way to the muscle. She realized that the blue neuron has transferred the impulse to the muscle. Now, this muscle contracts to cause the hands to change position. She realized that the hands move away from the source of stimulus. So it was initially here, but now it is over here, on top like this, due to the contraction of what? The muscle. So that is what basically happens. Now, I know you'll be wondering that why don't we wait for the brain to issue a command? Now, the answer to that question is pretty simple. You know, reflex actions are actually fast responses. They are very fast. The key word fast means they occur within shorter periods. Now, there's a source of stimulus, which is the fire over here. Now, assume we have to wait for the brain to issue a command. By the time the brain will finish processing these signals into appropriate responses or command, you realize that the damage would have been caused already. So this is actually why reflex actions do not depend on the brain to save the damage from being intense. That is all. So have that in mind as well, that reflex actions do not depend on the brain. Now, there are few things you need to take notice of. The neuron that actually carries the electrical heating in the form of electrical impulses from the fingers all the way to the spinal cord is a neuron that is called the sensory neuron. So this neuron is actually called the sensory neuron or the afferent neuron. Now, it's called afferent because it actually carries impulses from sensory receptors to the spinal cord. So it's kind of from outside to inside. That's why it's called afferent. So sensory neuron because it works with sense organ or sensory receptors. Now, the next neuron is the interneuron. Now, inter or relay neuron is the name of this particular neuron. So inter, in this case, means that it's actually between two different neurons. And for you to be able to remember relay, it actually relays information or carries electrical impulses from the sensory neuron to the next neuron close to it. So that is the blue neuron over there. Do you see it? So that is the function of the relay neuron, relaying information between two neurons and inter between them, so interneurons. The next neuron is this blue neuron over here. And that is the neuron that actually carries information to the muscle. And it's known as the motor neuron. The motor neuron or the efferent neuron. Now, efferent in this case means that it carries impulses away from the central nervous system. That is the spinal cord in this case. So efferent, away. Now, a quick way to be able to remember this is that the motor neuron, now motor actually works for movement. Motor moves. So that is what actually causes movement. So you realize that the moment the impulse were passed from the interneuron to the motor neuron, the position of the arm changed. It moved from the source of a stimulus to a very far end. And that is it. So motor is responsible for movement. So anytime you remember motor neuron, you should remember that it deals with what movement is, what actually causes movement. The movement is as a result of contraction of the muscle. So when the muscle contracts, the arm moves away. So that is it. From this, you could see we've created a one-way pathway. And the overall name for this one-way pathway is a reflex arc. So when we say a reflex arc, it is actually the pathway taken by nerve impulses to accomplish a reflex action.